Hi, I'm Mel from New Comics, and this is my presentation on Hickman's X-Men, and in particular his design for the Krakoan language. Now, if you haven't been following the X-Men line of comics since last summer, or if you've been hearing a lot of buzz around the series, but just haven't dipped your toes into the water just yet, here are some of the general notes to follow for what's been happening these past few months. Last summer, writer Jonathan Hickman led a Renaissance event for all of the X-Men titles through two back-to-back miniseries titled House of X and Powers of X. It's an amazing reconstruction of the X-Men landscape in the Marvel Universe that innovates and builds on the decades of X-Men stories that have existed up to this point. One of the key takeaways is that between the two series, we see a genuine alliance between the longtime rivals Charles Xavier and Magneto in an effort to see mutant kind thrive and survive. Through the House of X series, we observe the two mutant leaders work together to form a new society to care for all of mutant kind. And with this new society came the establishment of a new mutant nation-state, the island of Krakoa. Overall, House of X follows the cultural and political events taking place to shape the new world of the X-Men. Meanwhile, the Powers of X series follows a far more macro-scaled view of mutant kind by following the scattered history of the new mutant nation-state of Krakoa through its past, present, and future. Now, I've omitted a lot from both series, but this is the general information needed to follow along with what the X-Men series these past few months have been like. However, transitioning from the story to the writer, I think Jonathan Hickman's storytelling style over the years is also worth talking about. Anybody who's picked up a few issues of Hickman's work on the X-Men so far has definitely noticed the writer's commitment to fleshing out the new world of the mutants. From designing maps of the mutant nation-state of Krakoa with clearly defined districts, to fictional newsletters that are meant to better characterize the world's inhabitants. However, Hickman has had a history of committing to world building in plenty of his other works as well. Some very notable instances of Hickman taking the time to design and detail his fictional realms being the creation of Builder Machine Code in his run on the Avengers, the cartographic feat of constructing Battleworld from Secret Wars, and even more recently, he's had similar companion piece pages that serve to give a glimpse at the realm of his story in the pages of his new Decorum series. So it's really no surprise that Hickman has gone so far as to develop so many pages of fictional data entries to give the reader a better sense of the mutant world they're reading about. But there's one facet of Hickman's new world of the X-Men that I believe stands out above all the rest: the mutant language of Krakoan. For readers of Hickman's Avengers, the Krakoan language may seem a bit like a rehash of Hickman's short-lived attempt at fleshing out the Builder Machine Code, but I believe that comparing these two alphabets is a bit more like comparing apples to oranges. While they share similar aesthetic characteristics, their diegetic roles serve vastly different purposes. Now, the original script of House of X does describe Krakoan as being a bit more of a font, since all it's really doing is swapping out letters from the Latin alphabet with new symbols. But the in-story explanation of Krakoan is that it is indeed a new alphabet with unique symbols, phonology, syntax, and grammar unlike any other human language. Now, clearly Hickman has gone through a lot of work to design and explain the function of this entirely ancillary facet of his story's lore. However, I do believe it's worth asking why Hickman made the conscious decision of creating this pseudo-language in the first place. Hickman's use of Krakoan in both the narrative and the composition of each X-Men issue suggests the idea that the Krakoan language is meant to be far more than just a charming aesthetic that suits the New Mutant Society. Graphically, Krakoan is introduced to the reader through its presence on the X-Men title pages to present the name of each series and its issue number, as well as in the final pages teasing the next issue's core themes. Meanwhile, the language of Krakoan is introduced to the reader in a more explanatory form within the very first issue of House of X, as Magneto briefly monologues on the authority and cultural significance the new language is meant to have. And once we're well within the mutant lore and history that Hickman has crafted for us, we're finally privy to the diegetic origin of the Krakoan language, as Xavier tasks the mutant Cypher with the grand feat of working with the living island of Krakoa to design a new written language for their future mutant society. In each of these instances, from the subtle to the explicit, Hickman is clearly playing up the impact that this new language is meant to have. And while it's one thing to suggest that Krakoan matters, I think it's fair to try and explore the reasons why it matters as well. Now, an immediate answer as to why Krakoan matters as a language is because it helps accentuate the split between mutant and human society. Many of the mutant characters of the series make frequent remarks about how they need to shed the lifestyles, philosophies, and mindsets they were taught under mankind in order to better embrace their new mutant renaissance of Pax Krakoa. And as of late, we've seen that the citizens of Krakoa have formed their own systems of government, tradition, and rituals. But it's important to recognize that before they formed these identifying characteristics of their culture, they felt the need to develop their own language first. In Hickman's very first issue of the New Mutant Culture, Magneto defends the new language as the foundation for any distinct culture. And we can see that Xavier shares these sentiments by way of how he tasks Cypher with designing Krakoan an entire year before announcing his plan for a new mutant society. Now, this idea that unique language is necessary for the development of unique culture is in fact a theory held and developed most famously by 15th century linguist and humanist Antonio Nebrija. Nebrija was a humanist Spanish scholar whose work made him one of the most influential figures in shaping Spanish culture and politics. As a Renaissance humanist, he dedicated much of his life to studying both the history and languages that have shaped much of European culture up to the Renaissance. And his linguistic scholarship would go on to lead him to the grand task of codifying a grammar and dictionary for the language more contemporarily called Spanish. And so in 1492, Nebrija published his most famous work, Grammar of the Castilian Language. Now, Nebrija's grammar book was the first publication to catalog and codify any Romance language following the fall of Rome. Up to this point, most of the Romance languages were more considered as casual vernaculars of Latin, rather than full-fledged and independent languages. So at the time, many would question why Nebrija dedicated himself so wholeheartedly to caring about language, and one of them being the famed Spanish queen, Isabella I. And so, in an attempt to win the favor of not only the queen, but of any skeptical critics of his endeavor, Nebrija presented his readers with a prologue wherein he presents a new historiographical framework, a new way of looking at history. Nebrija proposes that instead of looking at history as the rise, climax, and fall of political powers, we should also consider thinking of history as the rise, climax, and fall of languages. Nebrija justifies this framework in his very first sentence, where he delivers his most famous line: "I find one thing and come to conclusion most certain, that always language was the companion of empire, and followed it such that together they began, grew, and flourished, and later, together they fell." Now, Nebrija's prologue specifically cites language walking alongside empire, but I would argue that this is more of a consequence of the mindsets of his time period. Given his era, Nebrija cannot imagine a nation being great without expanding and forming a militaristic empire. And from our modern perspective, his worldview has clear holes in logic. Krakoan culture has clearly made strides since the development of the Krakoan language, and they've made a clear and explicit refusal to engage in imperialism of any sort. So, instead, I believe it's more appropriate to adapt Nebrija's philosophy and say that always language was the companion of authority. Now, to defend this perspective of thinking of history as the growth and development of language, Nebrija refers to three cultures that have shaped much of Renaissance Europe, following their beginnings, heights, and declines through language: Hebrew of the Israelites, Ionic Greek of classical antiquity, and Latin under the Roman Empire. Nebrija attributes the landmark rise of each culture to the composition of some literary work. For the Hebrew language, he marks Moses for scribing the Ten Commandments. For classical Greek, he refers to Homer and his mythologic retelling of the Trojan War under the Iliad. And under Latin, he presents Livius Andronicus, the first Latin playwright and father of all Latin literature. And he justifies these as the beginning landmarks for how each work served to either encourage or emphasize a sense of unity and community for each respective culture. For the era of flourishment, Nebrija cites the literary and artistic blossom of Hebrew works under Solomon, the exploration of Greek science and philosophies under Alexander the Great, and the litany of poetry, dramas, and history recorded under Augustus Caesar in Latin. And for each culture's decline, Nebrija doesn't cite any specific event that led to the dissolution of their presence, but does note that each culture never quite recovered and spoke an entirely unified language as before. Overall, Nebrija's argument is that for any nation, culture, or society to thrive throughout history and truly make a legacy for itself, there needs to be some manifestation of designed and unified language. And to tie the discussion back to Hickman's X-Men, throughout the Powers of X series, we learned from first-hand accounts across dozens of timelines that mutant kind is almost destined to fight an uphill battle against history. Homo Superior never gets to reach an era of Pax Krakoa before Charles Xavier and Magneto decided to coordinate their efforts and help unify mutant culture under a common tongue. And now that we're several months into the new world of Dawn of X, we can see the amazing strides in culture that the island is making. I think it's important to recognize that none of it would have been possible without the symbolic power that comes with the unique language of KRAKOAN. And so with that, I leave you with this final slide, quoting Magneto from the first issue of House of X. "I have a new word for the lexicon of man, Krakoa. And in the future, when you speak it, make sure you do so softly and with proper deference, for we will be listening." Thank you.